looping through data to extract it. It's so important when it comes to programming, and I want to stress this. So I'm going to show you two examples. The one, I'm just going to loop through arrays, show you the different methods, and then as we've discussed in the lecture, I want to actually create an object with properties, name, value, pairs, and I want to loop through that. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to start coding a bit more complicated functions and calls and loops because we've come a long way, and I think you're getting really familiar with the traditional easy objects, arrays, and all of that. So let's create a function. Let's say we've got a whole list of members on our site and we want to loop through each member and give them a welcome message. How would we do that? Well, firstly, let's create a function, and we're going to get into functions in a completely whole new section. So don't worry about syntax yet. Just understand the concept. Let's define a function called hi, and let's say that function takes in the person's name, and all this function does is it returns our welcome message. Welcome, and we're using template literals here, and we're just going to console out their name. So next, let's define our members. And let's say we've got a whole member list. And we're just starting out, so we've only got two members, Tom and Jerry. But then let's say we get new users. Let's say we get new users. John and Wally. So, member list, let's push John. And let's do the same and push Wally. Now our member list should contain 4 members. And it does. And we're wanting to greet all members. How would we go about doing this? Well, remember how I keep stressing there's never one right way to do something, and there's lots of ways to loop through this array. Let's look at the traditional old school ways first. So the traditional for loop, and something worth remembering is that every for loop has curly braces at the end. And it's kind of like whatever we want to do in code goes in between these curly braces. What differs is what's in the parentheses here. So for the traditional, so let's start off here with traditional old school for loop. We have to define a variable, and that variable iterates by 1 each time the loop completes. So we can call this anything, but traditionally people like to call it I. So we say let I equal 0. So I is going to start at 0. And then the second parameter in this for loop says under what condition will the loop continue to loop. Because eventually the loop's going to have to stop. Otherwise it's going to be an infinite loop. So let's say here we only want this to iterate how many times? That's right. Only 4 times because there are 4 members, right? So we need I to be less than the member list length. And then the third parameter is what happens to I after the first iteration. And we want I to increase by 1. So when we start, I is 0, does the first loop. When it finishes that, I is going to be increased by 1, and then this condition is going to be tested. Hope it makes sense. And now I wanted to find a greeting, a particular greeting for each member. So let's say let greeting equals. This is where we want to return the hi function. And remember the hi function, one of its input parameters was the name of the individual. Well, what is the name of this individual on the first loop? Well, it's going to be our member list. And remember, to access properties on an array, we can use the square brackets. And here I is 0. On the first iteration, I'll be 0, and that will return the name Tom. And then all we're wanting to do is console log greeting. So there you have it. Welcome Tom, welcome Jerry, welcome John, welcome Wally. How cool is that? I hope you understand what it is we did. But again, this is an old school for loop. I'll show you a better way to do it. But before I show you the best way to do it, let me show you another old school way. It's called the for in loop. This is also an old school way, the for in loop. Again, we have the for, and then we've got these curly brackets. And now all we have to do is we have to get for const name in member list. So what this syntax is doing is on every loop, it's going to get each element in our array. We've called our element name because we know their names, Tom, Jerry, John, Wally. So it's going to grab that name in our object member list in our array. And then traditionally what this does is that this actually accesses all the prototypes properties as well. So it can get very cumbersome, and sometimes it accesses things it shouldn't. And for this reason, you often include an if statement within this for in loop. And you just have to say if member list, and there's a built-in property called has own property. And all we've got to say here is if this certain array has its own property and that is outside of any prototypes, then we want to execute this code. So now we've passed this if statement, we're in the block. What do we write? Well, the same thing. We want our greeting to execute that hi function, and we're going to be passing in each name of the member. So member list, and here we haven't called it I like we did above in that old school for loop. Here we've defined each iteration, we're going to have the name. It's going to be called name. So we pass in name. Now we've got our greeting, and all we want to do is console log this greeting. And Bob's your uncle. There we go. Welcome Tom, welcome Jerry, welcome John, welcome Wally. But you can see these methods are a bit cumbersome. Like, you really got to think about it. You've got to do a lot of typing. Let me show you the for of loop, which is awesome. For of loop. Okay, so let's do a for of loop. My IDE again helps me with this. Const iterator of object. So here we've got name, and our object is member list. And you'll see how much easier this is. This is going to loop through each name, each element of our array, of our object. All we need to do now is literally get our greeting, which is executing the hi function, and we've already got our name. And then we can console log our greeting. Can you see how much easier and simple the for of loop is? It's great. But I want to show you one more example now, because here we've been dealing with a simple array. I want to now deal with a more complicated object. So let me stop this video because it's getting a bit long. And in the next video, we're going to be dealing with an object, and then we're going to iterate through that object. See you soon.